Nat Turner was born a slave in Southampton County, Virginia in October 1800. His parents said that the special marks on his body were signs that he was intended for some great purpose. His master said that he learned to read without being taught. As an adolescent, he became a devoted Christian and fasted. In his 20s, he said he received visits from the Spirit, the same Spirit that had spoken to the ancient prophets. On another occasion, while working in a cornfield, he saw blood on the corn, and on another occasion, he saw angels, black and white, warring in the sky, portending some great conflict to come. In time, Turner began to interpret these things to mean that God had appointed him an instrument of divine vengeance for the sin of slaveholding. On the morning of August 22, 1831, he set out with 6 friends, Hark, Henry, Sam, Nelson, Will, and Jack, to punish slave owners. Turner struck the first blow, an axe to the head of his master, Joseph Travis. The rebels killed all of the white men, women, and children they encountered. By noon, they had visited 11 farms and slaughtered 57 whites. Along the way, they had added 50 or 60 men to their army. Word spread quickly, and soon the militia and hundreds of local whites gathered. They quickly captured or killed all of the rebels except Turner, who hid out for about 10 weeks before being captured in nearby woods. Within a week, he was tried, convicted, and executed. By then, 45 slaves had stood trial, 20 had been convicted and hanged, and another 10 had been banished from Virginia. Frenzied whites had killed another 100 or more blacks, insurgents and innocent bystanders alike, in their counterattack against the rebellion. White Virginians blamed the rebellion on outside agitators. In 1829, David Walker, a free-born black man living in Boston, had published his An Appeal to the Colored Citizens of the World, an invitation to slaves to rise up in bloody revolution, and copies had fallen into the hands of Virginia slaves. On January 1, 1831, the Massachusetts abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison had published the first issue of The Liberator, his fiery newspaper calling for the overthrow of slavery. In the months following the insurrection, the Virginia legislature reaffirmed the state's determination to preserve slavery by passing laws that strengthened the institution and further restricted free blacks. A professor at the College of William and Mary, Thomas R. Dew, published a vigorous defense of slavery that became the Bible of Southerners' pro-slavery arguments. More than ever, the nation was divided along the Mason-Dixon line, the surveyor's mark that in colonial times had established the boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania, but half a century later divided the free North and the slave South. Black slavery increasingly molded the South into a distinctive region. In the decades after 1820, Southerners, like Northerners, raced westward, but unlike Northerners, who spread small farms, manufacturing, and free labor, Southerners spread slavery, cotton, and plantations. Geographic expansion reinvigorated slavery and made it more profitable than ever. As it embraced more people, it increased the South's political power. Antebellum Southerners sometimes found themselves at odds with one another, not only slaves and free people, but also women and men, Indians, Africans, and Europeans, and aristocrats and common folk. Nevertheless, beneath this diversity, a distinctively Southern society and culture were forming. The South became a slave society, and most white Southerners were proud of it. From the earliest settlements, inhabitants of the Southern colonies had shared a great deal with Northern colonists. Most whites in both sections were British and Protestant, spoke a common language, and celebrated their victorious revolution against British rule and the creation of the new nation under the Constitution in 1789. The beginnings of a national economy fostered economic interdependence and communication across regional boundaries. White Americans everywhere praised the prosperous young nation, and they looked forward to its seemingly boundless future. Despite these national similarities, Southerners and Northerners grew increasingly different. The French political observer Alexis de Tocqueville believed he knew why. "I could easily prove," he asserted in 1831, "that almost all the differences which may be noticed between the character of the Americans in the Southern and Northern states have originated in slavery." And a quarter of a century after Tocqueville, neither Northerners nor Southerners liked the society that had developed on the other side of the Mason-Dixon line. On the subject of slavery, the Charleston Mercury declared, "The North and South are not only two peoples, but they are rival, hostile peoples." Slavery made the South different, and it was the differences between the North and South, not the similarities, that increasingly shaped antebellum American history. In the first half of the 19th century, millions of Americans migrated west. In the South, the stampede began after the Creek War of 1813-1814, which cost the Creek Indians 24 million acres and initiated the government campaign to remove Indian peoples living east of the Mississippi River. Hard-driving slaveholders seeking virgin land for new plantations, ambitious farmers looking for patches for small farms, striving herders and drovers pushing their hogs and cattle toward fresh pastures, everyone felt the pull of western land. More than anything, however, it was cotton that propelled Southerners westward. South of the Mason-Dixon line, climate and geography were ideally suited for the cultivation of cotton, and by the 1830s, cotton fields stretched from the Atlantic seaboard to central Texas. Heavy migration led to statehood for Arkansas in 1836 and for Texas and Florida in 1845. Cotton production soared to nearly 5 million bales in 1860 when the South produced 3/4 of the world's supply. The South, especially that tier of states from South Carolina west to Texas called the Lower South, had become the Cotton Kingdom. The Cotton Kingdom was also a slave empire. The South's cotton boom rested on the backs of slaves. As cotton agriculture expanded westward, whites shipped more than 1 million enslaved men, women, and children from the Atlantic coast westward in what has been called the Second Middle Passage, a massive deportation that dwarfed the transatlantic slave trade to North America. Victims of this brutal domestic slave trade marched hundreds of miles southwest to the Lower South, where they literally cut new plantations from the forests. Cotton, slaves, and plantations moved west together. The slave population grew enormously. Southern slaves numbered fewer than 700,000 in 1790, about 2 million in 1830, and almost 4 million by 1860. By 1860, the South contained more slaves than all the other slave societies in the New World combined. The extraordinary growth was not the result of the importation of slaves, which the federal government outlawed in 1808. Instead, the slave population grew through natural reproduction. By mid-century, the great majority of U.S. slaves were native-born Southerners. By 1860, 1 in every 3 Southerners was black, approximately 4 million blacks to 8 million whites. In the lower South states of Mississippi and South Carolina, blacks constituted the majority. The contrast with the North was striking. In 1860, only 1 Northerner in 76 was black, about 250,000 blacks to 19 million whites. The presence of large numbers of African Americans had profound consequences for the South. Southern culture, language, food, music, religion, and even accents was shaped substantially by blacks. But the most direct consequence of the South's biracialism was Southern whites' commitment to white supremacy. Northern whites believed in their racial superiority too, but their dedication to white supremacy lacked the intensity and urgency increasingly felt by white Southerners who lived among millions of slaves who had every reason to strike back. After 1820, attacks on slavery, from slaves in the South and from Northern abolitionists, caused white Southerners to make extraordinary efforts to strengthen slavery. State legislatures enacted slave codes that required the total submission of slaves. These laws underlined the authority of all whites, not just masters. Any white could correct slaves who did not stay in their place. Intellectuals joined legislators in the campaign to strengthen slavery. The South's professors, writers, and clergy constructed every imaginable defense. They argued that slaves were legal property, and wasn't the protection of property the bedrock of American liberty? History also endorsed slavery, they claimed. Weren't the great civilizations, such as those of the Hebrews, Greeks, and Romans, slave societies? They argued that the Bible, properly interpreted, also sanctioned slavery. Old Testament patriarchs owned slaves, they observed, and in the New Testament, Paul returned the runaway slave Onesimus to his master. Pro-slavery spokesmen claimed that the freeing of slaves would lead to the sexual mixing of the races, or miscegenation. George Fitzhugh of Virginia defended slavery by attacking the North's free labor economy and society. Gouging capitalists exploited wage workers unmercifully, Fitzhugh declared, and he contrasted the North's vicious free labor system with the humane relations that he said prevailed between masters and slaves. Slaves were protected, he said, because they were valuable capital that masters sought to protect. As evidence, John C. Calhoun, an influential Southern politician, argued that in the states where slavery had been abolished, the condition of the African, instead of being improved, has become worse, while in the slave states the Africans have improved greatly in every respect. At the heart of the defense of slavery, however, lay the claim of innate black inferiority. Black enslavement was necessary, pro-slavery champions argued, because Africans were lesser beings. Rather than exploitative, slavery was a mass civilizing effort that lifted lowly blacks from African barbarism and savagery, taught them disciplined work, and converted them to soul-saving Christianity. African slavery encouraged Southern whites to unify around race rather than to divide by class. The poorest, filthiest white man could proudly proclaim his superiority to all blacks and his equality with the most refined Southern gentlemen. By providing every white Southerner membership in the ruling class, slavery helped whites bridge vast differences in wealth, education, and culture. Slave ownership in the antebellum South has often been misunderstood as ubiquitous in order to explain the depth of Southern commitment to the Confederacy in the Civil War. However, an adult slave in 1835, as can be seen from this bill of sale, cost approximately $500 on average, which amounts to almost $15,000 in the year 2020 when adjusted for inflation. Experienced female and skilled male slaves were still more expensive, ranging from $600 to $700 each, which limited slave ownership to the higher levels of Southern society. Only 25% of white Southerners owned even a single slave, and only about 15% of this fraction owned 20 or more, qualifying them as planter elites. Take a moment to look more closely at this invoice for slaves purchased on behalf of one John Williamson, which shows these fairly typical prices for a variety of men and women purchased. Notice the notation at the bottom. Defenders of slavery in the antebellum period pushed back against accusations by abolitionists that slaveholders broke up families, particularly the separating of children from their mothers. But here, while Nancy Aulick did not lose her baby, it was not due to any kindness or compassion on the part of the purchasing agent. Despite their small numbers, planters dominated the Southern economy. In 1860, 52% of the South's slaves lived and worked on plantations, where they produced more than 75% of the South's cotton and other export crops, the backbone of the region's economy. While slavery was dying elsewhere in the New World, only Brazil and Cuba still had slaves by mid-century, plantations increasingly dominated Southern agriculture. The South's major cash crops, tobacco, sugar, rice, and cotton, grew on plantations. Tobacco, the original plantation crop in North America, had shifted westward in the 19th century from the Chesapeake to Tennessee and Kentucky. Large-scale sugar production began in 1795 when Etienne de Boré built a modern sugar mill in what is today New Orleans, and sugar plantations were confined almost entirely to Louisiana. Commercial rice production began in the 17th century, and like sugar, rice was confined to a small geographic area, a narrow strip of coast stretching from the Carolinas into Georgia. By the 19th century, cotton reigned as king of the South's plantation crops. Cotton became commercially significant in the 1790s after the invention of the new cotton gin by Eli Whitney. Cotton was relatively easy to grow and took little capital to get started, just enough for land, seed, and simple tools. Thus, small farmers as well as planters grew cotton. But planters, whose extensive fields were worked by gangs of slaves, produced 3/4 of the South's cotton, and cotton made planters rich. Plantation slavery also enriched the nation. By 1840, cotton accounted for more than 60% of American exports. Most of the cotton was shipped to Great Britain, the world's largest manufacturer of cotton textiles. Much of the profit from the sale of cotton overseas returned to planters, but some went to northern middlemen who bought, sold, insured, warehoused, and shipped cotton to the mills in Great Britain. As middlemen invested their profits in the expanding northern economy, industrial development received a burst of much-needed capital. Furthermore, southern plantations benefited northern industry by providing an important market for textiles, agricultural tools, and other manufactured products. It is important here to remember that the North's textile industry, particularly in New England, depended very heavily on cotton importations from the Deep South. While the northern states had either immediately or gradually abolished slavery, essentially because their regional economies did not require massive amounts of labor due to differences in soil composition and climate that precluded large-scale agriculture outside of Pennsylvania, the northern states grew to depend upon the South's slave labor almost as much as did the South itself. The economies of the North and South steadily diverged. While the North developed a mixed economy, agriculture, commerce, and manufacturing, the South remained overwhelmingly agricultural. Year after year, planters funneled the profits they earned from land and slaves back into more land and more slaves. With its capital flowing into agriculture, the South did not develop many factories. By 1860, only 10% of the nation's industrial workers lived and worked in the South. Some cotton mills sprang up, but the region that produced 100% of the nation's cotton manufactured less than 7% of its cotton cloth. Without significant economic diversification, the South developed fewer cities than the North and West. In 1860, it was the least urban region in the country. Whereas nearly 37% of New England's population lived in cities, less than 12% of Southerners were urban dwellers. Because the South had so few cities and industrial jobs, it attracted fewer European immigrants. Seeking economic opportunity, not competition with slaves, whose labor would keep wages low, immigrants steered northward. In 1860, 13% of all Americans were born abroad, but in 9 of the 15 slave states, only 2% or less of the population was foreign-born. Northerners claimed that slavery was a backward labor system, and compared with Northerners, Southerners invested less of their capital in industry, transportation, and public education. But few Southerners perceived economic weakness in their region. Indeed, planters' pockets were never fuller than in the 1850s thanks to the South's near monopoly on cotton, the hottest commodity in the international marketplace. Planters' decisions to reinvest in cotton ensured the continuation of the plantation economy and the political and social relationships rooted in it. The vast majority of slave owners, however, were small to middling commercial farmers who could not afford to hire overseers to manage slave laborers. Consequently, these masters tended to work alongside their slaves, and in the case of small slaveholders, often housed their slaves in their homes with their families, though this was more out of necessity than out of generosity. This suggests a fascinating dynamic of which we have practically no documentary evidence. What sorts of relationships did these masters have with their slaves? While the master of a large plantation could enjoy keeping a physical and emotional distance from his slaves, which would facilitate an attitude of indifference or certainly cruelty, small slaveholders could not do so, and thus must have had to forge a kind of working relationship built upon a certain degree of trust and camaraderie. This is not to suggest that such a thing verged on friendship, but it is hard to imagine that people working in constant close proximity with each other could not have ended up understanding one another in ways that eluded the large slaveholders. The documentary evidence we do have mostly comes from the large plantations that kept meticulous records, and there we have the usual picture of daily life, the distant, imperious master lording over his family and dozens of slaves managed by white overseers. Nowhere was the contrast between northern and southern life more vivid than on the plantations of the South. A plantation typically included a big house where the plantation owner and his family lived, and a slave quarter. Near the big house were the kitchen, storehouse, smokehouse for curing and preserving meat, and hen coop. More distant were the barns, tool sheds, artisans' workshops, and overseer's house. Large plantations sometimes had a rude hospital and a chapel for slaves. Depending on the crop, there was also a tobacco shed, a rice mill, a sugar refinery, or a cotton gin house. Lavish or plain, plantations everywhere had an underlying similarity. The plantation was the home of masters, mistresses, and slaves. A hierarchy of rigid roles and duties governed their relationships. Presiding was the master, who by law ruled his wife, children, and slaves as dependents under his authority and protection. Whereas smaller planters supervised the labor of their slaves themselves, larger planters hired overseers who went to the fields with the slaves, leaving the planters free to concentrate on marketing, finance, and the general affairs of the plantation. Planters also found time to escape to town to discuss crop prices, to the courthouse and legislature to debate politics, and to the woods to hunt and fish. Increasingly, planters characterized their mastery in terms of what they called Christian guardianship and what historians have called paternalism. The concept of paternalism denied that the form of slavery practiced in the South was brutal and exploitative. Instead, paternalism claimed that plantations benefited everyone. In exchange for the slaves' work and obedience, masters provided basic care and necessary guidance for a childlike, dependent people. In 1814, Thomas Jefferson captured the essence of the advancing ideal. We should endeavor, with those whom fortune has thrown on our hands, to feed and clothe them well, protect them from ill usage, require such reasonable labor only as is performed voluntarily by freemen, and be led by no repugnancies to abdicate them and our duties to them. A South Carolina rice planter insisted, "I manage them as my children." Paternalism depended upon slaveholders convincing themselves that they treated their slaves with parental kindness and mercy, but the degrees to which they actually believed that good treatment led to greater obedience and loyalty from their slaves vary wildly. Jefferson may have been sincere, seeing in paternalism a thoughtful strategy that improved his financial bottom line, but the proportion of slaveholders who honestly believed in and genuinely practiced paternalism of this degree was very small. Paternalism was part propaganda and part self-delusion, but it was also economically shrewd. Masters increasingly recognized slaves as valuable assets, particularly after the nation closed its external slave trade in 1808 and the cotton boom stimulated the demand for slaves. The expansion of the slave labor force could come only from natural reproduction. One consequence of this economic self-interest was a small improvement in slaves' welfare. Diet improved slightly, although 19th century slaves still ate mainly fatty pork and cornmeal. Housing improved, although the cabins still had cracks large enough, slaves said, for cats to slip through. Clothing improved, although slaves seldom received much more than 2 crude outfits a year and perhaps a pair of cheap shoes. While most planters offered a rest period in the heat of the day and curbed the colonial practice of punishing slaves by branding and mutilation, workdays remained long, from sunup to sundown. Paternalism encouraged better treatment because it made economic sense to provide at least minimal care for valuable slaves. But paternalism did not require that planters put down their whips. They could whip and still claim that they were only fulfilling their responsibilities as guardians of their naturally lazy and at times insubordinate black dependents. State laws gave masters nearly uncontrolled authority over the body of the slave, and whipping remained planters' basic form of coercion. Most planters believed they whipped their slaves no more than was necessary to get the work done, but that meant that on plantations the whip fell on someone's back every few days. Paternalism never won universal acceptance among planters, but by the 19th century it had become a kind of communal standard. With its notion that slavery imposed on masters a burden and a duty, paternalism provided slaveholders with a means of rationalizing their rule. But it also provided some slaves with leverage in controlling the conditions of their lives. Slaves learned to manipulate the slaveholder's need to see himself as a good master. To avoid a reputation as a cruel tyrant, planters sometimes negotiated with slaves rather than just resorting to the whip. Masters sometimes allowed slaves to have their own vegetable gardens and perhaps some chickens or hogs of their own to supplement their food rations of corn, rice, and a little beef. State laws forbade work on Sundays, and the clever master often gave slaves Saturday afternoons off so that they could prepare for church the next morning. They encouraged slave marriages, though they were not legally recognized, and often would throw a wedding celebration to which slaves from neighboring plantations would be invited. Nevertheless, cruel and sadistic masters were too common in the history of slavery in America, and slaves sometimes ran to the masters of other plantations either to complain of cruel treatment or ask to be purchased by him if his reputation as a kind master was known. In this way, slaves could turn the philosophy of paternalism to their advantage, forcing slave owners to apply peer pressure on one another to be more lenient and generous, although not always successfully. Overseers could also be leveraged. Usually only poor whites opted for this career path, and overseers vary between 2 extremes: the overly sadistic and cruel who whipped slaves with almost gleeful abandon in order to frighten them into feverish work, or the lackadaisical sort, who used the whip as little as he could get away with, using promises of rewards in exchange for getting necessary tasks done. In this respect, slaves could get the worst overseers fired by complaining of unrelentingly harsh treatment to their masters, while keeping quiet about weak overseers who could be manipulated for good treatment. Being a successful overseer carried the potential for boosting a lower-class white man's fortunes, and so he had to walk a fine line between effective, stern management of his employer's slaves and ingratiating himself with the slaves under his supervision enough so that they would follow his orders without significant resistance. Evidence of fairly high turnover rates for overseers suggests that fine line was too often too fine. Virginia statesman Edmund Randolph argued that slavery created in white Southern men a quick and acute sense of personal liberty and a disdain for every abridgment of personal independence. Indeed, prickly individualism and aggressive independence became crucial features of the Southern concept of honor. Social standing, political advancement, and even self-esteem rested on an honorable reputation. Defending honor became a male passion. Andrew Jackson's mother reportedly told her son, "Never tell a lie, nor take what is not your own, nor sue anybody for slander or assault and battery. Always settle them cases yourself." Among planters, such advice sometimes led to dueling, a ritual that had arrived from Europe in the 18th century. It died out in the North, but in the South, even after legislatures banned it, gentlemen continued to defend their honor with pistols at 20 paces. Duels were fought by Andrew Jackson, whose wife one foolish man slandered, as well as by two South Carolina college students who happened at dinner to reach simultaneously for the last piece of trout. Southerners also expected an honorable gentleman to be a proper patriarch. Nowhere in America was masculine power more apparent. Planters allowed no opposition from any of their dependents, black or white. The master's power sometimes led to miscegenation. Laws prohibited interracial sex, but as long as slavery gave white men extraordinary power, slave women were forced to submit to the sexual demands of the men who owned them. In time, as the white children of one elite family married the white children of another, ties of blood and kinship, as well as ideology and economic interest, linked planters to one another. Aware of what they shared as slaveholders, planters worked together to defend their common interests. The values of the big house, slavery, honor, male domination, washed over the boundaries of plantations and flooded all of Southern life. Like their Northern counterparts, white Southern women were expected to possess the feminine virtues of piety, purity, chastity, and obedience within the context of marriage, motherhood, and domesticity. Countless toasts praised the Southern lady as the perfect complement to her husband, the commanding patriarch. She was physically weak, and thus dependent on male protection. To gain this protection, she exhibited modesty and delicacy, possessed beauty and grace, and cultivated refinement and charm. The lady, Southern men said proudly, was an ornament. Chivalry, the South's romantic ideal of male-female relationships, glorified the white lady while it subordinated her. Chivalry's underlying assumptions about the weakness of women and the protective authority of men resembled the paternalistic defense of slavery. As the slaveholder's mastery was written into law, so too were the superior rights of husbands. Married women lost almost all their property rights to their husbands. Women throughout the nation found divorce difficult, but Southern women found it nearly impossible. Daughters of planters confronted chivalry's demands at an early age. At their private boarding schools, they learned to be Southern ladies, reading literature, learning languages, and studying the appropriate drawing room arts. Elite women began courting young and married early. Yet marriage meant turning their fates over to their husbands and making enormous efforts to live up to the South's lofty expectations. Caroline Merrick of Louisiana told a friend in 1859, "We owe it to our husbands, children, and friends to represent as nearly as possible the ideal which they hold so dear." Pro-slavery advocates claim that slavery freed white women from the drudgery of housework. "Surrounded by her domestics," declared Thomas R. Dew, "she ceases to be a mere beast of burden and becomes the cheering and animating center of the family circle." In reality, however, having servants required the plantation mistress to work long hours. She managed the big house, directly supervising sometimes more than a dozen slaves. One slaveholder remembered that his boyhood home had 2 cooks, 2 washerwomen, 1 dining room servant, 2 seamstresses, 1 house girl, 1 house boy, 1 carriage driver, 1 stableman, 1 gardener, and 1 errand boy, all under the supervision of the mother. But unlike her husband, the mistress had no overseer. All house servants answered directly to her. She assigned them tasks each morning, directed their work throughout the day, and punished them when she found fault. One fascinating aspect of the lives of slave women and how they intertwined with those of whites is to look at the precarious role slave nannies had to play. In elite Southern households, mistresses who had just given birth most likely saw to the purchase of a wet nurse for her child, a slave woman who herself had recently given birth and thus was lactating. This woman would be responsible for the bulk of the care given to a child from infancy until puberty. Consider the woman in this photograph, posing with her charge. Notice how well she is dressed, denoting that she belonged to a very wealthy family that made sure that she was well attired as a show of their status. She would be ordered to give this little boy absolute priority, which meant that she would not be able to give as much attention to her own biological child, which would likely be raised as much by her as by other women in the slave quarter. It might be tempting to assume that she hates this child, but that would be a foolish assumption. She knows that it is not this child's fault that he was born white and the son of her owner, and so a bond most likely formed between them in the many hours she spent nursing this child at her breast, changing his diapers, and caring for him. His relationship to his biological mother was most likely a comparatively distant one, in which he always called her mother or ma'am, and reserved the more affectionate name of Mammy for this woman, from whom he received emotional support. When he skinned his knee or got his feelings hurt, it was to her that he would run, not to mother. If this woman had a husband, then he would also serve as a kind of surrogate father, whom he would call Pappy. His nurse's biological child would be his first playmate and probably a close friend in childhood, though likely destined to be his personal servant upon reaching adulthood. Knowing that if she lived beyond her owner's death, this boy would become her new master, and likely she found ways to subtly inculcate in him the imperative that he be a good and kind master, though she would have to be extremely careful in how she went about that. As members of slaveholding families, mistresses lived privileged lives, but they also had grounds for discontent. No feature of plantation life generated more anguish among mistresses than miscegenation. Mary Boykin Chestnut of Camden, South Carolina, confided in her diary, "Ours is a monstrous system, a wrong and iniquity. Like the patriarchs of old, our men live all in one house with their wives and their concubines, and the mulattoes one sees in every family partly resemble the white children. Any lady is ready to tell you who is the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household but their own. Those, she seems to think, dropped from the clouds." But most planters' wives, including Chestnut, accepted and defended slavery. After all, the privileged life of a mistress rested on slave labor as much as a master's did. Mistresses enjoyed the rewards of their class and race, but these rewards came at a price. Still, the heaviest burdens of slavery fell not on those who lived in the big house, but on those who toiled to support them. On most plantations, only a few hundred yards separated the big house and the slave quarter, but the distance was great enough to provide slaves with some privacy. Out of eyesight and earshot of the big house, slaves drew together and built lives of their own. They created families and developed an African American community and culture. Individually and collectively, slaves found ways to resist their bondage. Despite the rise of plantations, almost half of the South's slaves lived and worked elsewhere. Most labored on small farms where they wielded a hoe alongside another slave or two and their master. But by 1860, almost 500,000 slaves, 1 in 8, did not work in agriculture at all. Some lived in towns and cities where they worked as domestics, day laborers, bakers, barbers, tailors, and more. Other slaves, far from urban centers, toiled as fishermen, lumbermen, railroad workers, and deckhands on riverboats. Slaves could also be found in most of the South's factories. Nevertheless, a majority of slaves counted plantations as their workplaces and homes. Whites enslaved blacks for their labor, and all slaves who were able to worked. Former slave Carrie Hudson recalled that children were sent to the fields to carry water to thirsty workers or to protect ripening crops from hungry birds by running about and making noise. Older children helped in the slave nursery, caring for younger children, or in the big house, where they swept floors or shooed flies in the dining room. When slave boys and girls reached the age of 11 or 12, masters sent most of them to the fields. After a lifetime of hard work, old women left the fields to care for the small children and spin yarn, and old men moved on to mind livestock and clean stables. The overwhelming majority of plantation slaves worked as field hands. Planters sometimes assigned men and women to separate gangs, the women working at lighter tasks and the men doing the heavy work of clearing and breaking the land. But women also did heavy work. "I had to work hard," Nancy Boudry remembered, "and plow and go and split wood just like a man." The back-breaking labor and the monotonous routines caused one ex-slave to observe that the history of one day is the history of every day. A few slaves, about 1 in 10, became house servants. Nearly all of those, 9 out of 10, were women. They cooked, cleaned, babysat, washed clothes, and did the dozens of other tasks the master and mistress required. House servants were constantly on call, with no time that was entirely their own. Even rarer than house servants were skilled artisans. In the cotton belt, no more than 1 slave in 20, almost all men, worked in a skilled trade. Most were blacksmiths and carpenters, but slaves also worked as masons, mechanics, millers, and shoemakers. Rarest of all slave occupations was that of slave driver. Probably no more than 1 male slave in 100 worked in this capacity. These men were well named, for their primary task was driving other slaves to work harder in the fields. In some drivers' hands, the whip never rested. But other drivers showed all the restraint they could. Normally, slaves worked from what they called can to can't, from can see in the morning to can't see at night. Even with a break at noon for a meal and rest, it made for a very long day. Slaves did not suffer slavery passively. They understood that accommodation to what they could not change was the price of survival. But in 100 ways they protested their bondage. Supposedly, the master was all-powerful and the slave powerless. But sustained by their families, religion, and community, slaves engaged in day-to-day resistance against their enslavers. The spectrum of slave resistance ranged from mild to extreme. Telling a pointed story by the fireside in a slave cabin was probably the mildest form of protest. When the weak got the better of the strong, as they did in tales of Brer Rabbit and Brer Fox, Brer is a contraction of brother, listeners could imagine such a victory over their own masters. Protest in the fields was riskier and included putting rocks in their cotton bags before having them weighed, feigning illness, and pretending to be so thick-headed that they could not understand the simplest instruction. Sabotage was a common tactic. Slaves broke so many hoes that owners outfitted the tools with oversized handles. Slaves so mistreated the work animals that masters switched from horses to mules, which could absorb more abuse. Although slaves worked in the master's fields, they also undermined his interests. Running away was a common form of protest, but except along the borders with northern states and with Mexico, escape to freedom was almost impossible. Most runaways could hope only to escape for a few days. They would get their friends and family to cover for them and take off either to some secluded spot where they could lie out for a few days, or perhaps to a neighboring plantation to visit other friends and family members. So common was this practice that so-called slave roads connected plantations through and alongside forests on well-worn paths. Masters and overseers were generally aware of these slave roads, and would only lightly punish the returning slave so long as he or she was not gone for more than a few days. However, if too many of one's slaves were taking these impromptu holidays too often, then brutal reprisals would follow. Knowing this, slaves tended to be very careful about their absconding. Although resistance was common, outright rebellion, a violent assault on slavery by large numbers of slaves, was exceedingly rare. Conditions gave rebels almost no chance of success. By 1860, whites in the South outnumbered blacks 2 to 1 and were heavily armed. Also, communication between plantations was difficult, and the South provided little protective wilderness into which rebels could retreat and defend themselves. Rebellion was virtual suicide. In addition to light sabotage, deliberately working slowly, feigning illness or injury to get out of a day's work, or lying out for a bit, slaves found subtler ways to resist their enslavement and find some tiny bit of empowerment. Physically intimidating and/or charismatic slaves might be able to manipulate overseers and, in very rare cases, even masters themselves to obtain privileges or gentler treatment for themselves or others. Most, however, relied upon a ready wit to get what they wanted, or otherwise simply ridiculed their presumptive betters. One slave in Virginia recalled how he saw his master riding in the field in which he was working, and called him over to report that he had seen a lion in the adjoining field that reminded him of his noble master. The master, who subscribed to a belief that African Americans were naturally childlike and stupid, chuckled at his slave's credulity and told him that there is no way that he could have seen a lion, since such creatures do not live in America. Remember that the lion is the so-called king of the beasts, and so the master apparently believed that his slave was simply complimenting him and acknowledging him as a powerful figure. But then the slave started pointing and shouting, "There it is now! There's the lion!" Looking to where the slave was pointing, the master saw a donkey standing by the fence. Again, presuming the slave's childlike ignorance, the master laughed and said, "That's no lion, that's just a jackass." The slave then admitted that he must have been mistaken about what a lion looked like, and the master rode on, puffed up that his slave seemed to respect him so highly as to think him a lion, even when he seemed to have no idea what a lion really looks like. Obviously, once the master was out of earshot, the slave probably elbowed his co-workers about how he could call his master a jackass without being reprimanded, much less punished. A former slave told a story about how he was the keeper of his master's swine and got caught by an overseer slaughtering a few of them without permission. He explained to the overseer that he had to kill them quickly because they were infected with mellitus and that they had to die lest they infect the rest of the pigs in the herd. The overseer was at first skeptical, but, not knowing anything about pigs, he had to defer to the slave's expertise and asked if all of the sick ones had been dispatched. "Well, no," the slave answered. "Those 2 over there are sick too. Can I cull them?" The overseer gave his permission and left, knowing that if the entire herd died of some illness and he had prevented the slave from stopping it before that could happen, he would be the one to get in trouble. Meanwhile, the slave proceeded to kill the next 2 using a mallet to bash their heads in. Mellitus was a ruse, of course, for the slave to kill some hogs for extra meat for the people in the quarter. This exhibits how whites had to, on the one hand, believe that blacks were intellectually inferior, but at the same time had to recognize their expertise in a wide array of endeavors around plantations and farms. Just as Mary Chestnut noted that plantation mistresses seemed to know all about others' transgressions while ignoring those taking place under their noses, so also did many masters declare that slaves were tricky and always looking to pull the wool over their masters' eyes, but never seemed to think that their slaves would do such things to them. Steady resistance did not mean that slaves had the power to end their bondage. Centuries of slavery thwarted their hopes and aspirations. It broke some and crippled others, but slavery's destructive power had to contend with the power of the human spirit. Slaves fought back physically, culturally, and spiritually. The slave-holding philosophy of paternalism propagated the ideal of the perfectly obedient slave who genuinely loved and respected his master. This figure they dubbed Sambo, upon whom slaveholders projected their deepest wishes as a bulwark against their darkest fears engendered by a simple recognition of reality. Sambo never causes any trouble, always shows respect, professes his love for his master, and if asked to consider the prospect of liberation, steadfastly refuses to think about such a thing as being an awful fate to have befall him when his master provides him with everything he could possibly need or want. Considering the vast number of slaves who were born into bondage and subjected to unrelenting cruelty and dehumanization every day of their lives, Doubtless some slaves adopted this Sambo identity as their only means of psychological survival. Others did so as a means to gain privileges in order to find power and autonomy in a system designed to deny them both. However, as the constant existence of resistance proves, most slaves conformed to a different sort of identity, which some historians call Cuffy. Cuffy looks, sounds, and acts like Sambo, except he harbors a spirit of resistance and insists upon his humanity in as many ways as possible. Those who opted to run away permanently were only occasionally successful. Some groups of slaves found oases of freedom in remote areas that came to be known as maroon communities, while some others managed to find refuge with nearby or distant Indian communities. Those who chose violent rebellion were never successful. Even the rumor of a rebellion was enough to start waves of torture and summary executions. In the late 18th century, the slaves on one plantation in Virginia armed themselves with sharp tools and invaded their master's house, slaughtering him and his entire family before moving on to enlarge their numbers and start a general insurrection. They failed to find much support, were informed upon by other slaves, and hunted down by local militiamen who summarily executed the rebels and beheaded them. The severed heads were stacked on the front steps of the master's house, and neighboring slaves were made to troop past to see the gruesome sight as a warning against rebellion. Interestingly, the first body the authorities discovered in the house was that of the nurse, who apparently tried to block the back door leading into the kitchen, presumably intending to protect the children under her care. Steady resistance did not mean that slaves had the power to end their bondage. Centuries of slavery thwarted their hopes and aspirations. It broke some and crippled others. But slavery's destructive power had to contend with the power of the human spirit. Slaves fought back physically, culturally, and spiritually. Not only did they survive bondage, but they also created in their quarter a vibrant African American culture that buoyed them up during long hours in the fields and brought them joy and hope in the few hours they had to themselves. At night and all day Sunday and usually Saturday afternoon, slaves were left largely to themselves. Bone-tired perhaps, they nonetheless used the time to develop what mattered most to them. Over the generations, they created a community and a culture of their own that sustained them. Slavery was a severe assault on the slave family. Between 1820 and 1860, some 1 million slaves entered the interstate slave trade that fed labor to the booming Cotton South, and perhaps twice as many slaves were sold locally. Every slave dreaded the appearance of a slave trader at the gate of the plantation. Falling into the hands of a trader meant separation from family, probably for life, and a new existence under an unknown master. Though severely battered, the black family survived slavery. Young men and women in the quarter fell in love, married, and set up housekeeping in cabins of their own. But no laws recognized slave marriage, and therefore no master was legally obligated to honor the bond. While some slave marriages were long-lasting, the massive deportation associated with the Second Middle Passage and local sales destroyed hundreds of thousands of slave families. Masters sometimes permitted slave families to work on their own, overwork as it was called. In the evenings and on Sundays, they tilled gardens, raised pigs and fowl, and chopped wood, selling the products in the market for a little money. While it is tempting to presume that slaves used their earnings to save up to buy themselves out of slavery, this was an exceptionally rare phenomenon. A slave might be able to earn about as much in a week as the lowest paid white factory workers made in the North, meaning that it would usually take at least 9 or 10 years to save up enough money to purchase oneself, and in any case, such a transaction depends highly upon the owner being willing to sell. It was not uncommon for slave owners to demand a cut of the money a slave earned on the side in exchange for permission to do such extra work in the first place, often resulting in the time needed to earn enough money extending into decades. Instead, most slaves used their earnings to buy necessities and small luxuries to make their lives more comfortable, especially good clothes to wear to church on Sundays and for special occasions. The African American cultures that developed in the South were strongly rooted in the great mixture of African cultures created by the Atlantic slave trade and the slaves' placement in North America. Recall that a relatively small percentage of approximately 4 million Africans were forcibly deported to the British colonies in the early United States between 1619 and 1808 when the U.S. abolished the slave trade. The African origins of slaves in North America can be determined through an analysis of records kept by the British Royal African Company that handled the removal of people from Africa to the British colonies in the early United States. In the late 18th century colonies of the Upper South, that is, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and North Carolina, of the more than 4,000 Africans transported, most of them were of the Bantu, Wolof, Coromantee, and Yoruba peoples. Of the almost 17,000 taken to the Lower South, that is, South Carolina and Georgia, in the 1770s, most of them were of the Mandinga, Kisi, Coromantee, Benin, Igbo, and Bantu peoples. Working conditions in the Upper South tended to be healthier for slaves there, who reproduced in large enough numbers to keep slave markets humming with activity rather than depending on heavy importation of Africans, which strongly influenced the development of an African American culture that drew more on surrounding British influences than on streams of African culture brought by newcomers. By contrast, the Lower South imported much larger numbers of Africans from a wider range of peoples, and this resulted in a much stronger African influence on the development of African American culture there than anywhere else. These differences can be seen in the things that slaves made for themselves, from the way they constructed their housing to the cooking and drinking vessels they fashioned from wood or clay, the ways that they prepared their food, the way that they spoke English, and the kinds of music they composed and played for one another likewise showed divergences. It would take too long to go into any real detail about these differences, but let's take language as an example. The English that African Americans spoke in the Upper South was strongly influenced by that of the whites all around them, but showed some inflections from native African languages that smoothed out over generations. The presence of African words and idioms are relatively small, but nonetheless obvious. In the Lower South, where there were strong and persistent African infusions until the early 18 teens, slaves and free blacks there spoke an English that was heavily influenced by African languages. On the sea islands of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, distinct African English languages developed, called Gullah and Geechee, respectively, that whites found next to impossible to understand. A similar dynamic appeared among slaves along the Gulf Coast of Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, where slaves from Georgia and the Carolinas mixed with slaves and free blacks from Haiti and the Caribbean. Language became a means of resistance for slaves, as various Pidgin English dialects developed that allowed slaves to talk to one another in ways that baffled most whites who overheard them. Most American-born slaves could understand and speak American English well enough, but apart from house slaves who regularly had to go into town to run errands, slaves preferred to speak broken and ignorant-sounding English around white people in order to reinforce the conventional wisdom that blacks are naturally stupid. It was, more importantly, a way to create a unique cultural identity that stood in stark contrast to that of the whites, especially that of the master class. Interestingly, African American speech patterns infiltrated the English spoken by Southern whites, particularly those of the lower classes. Other aspects of African American culture similarly became embedded in Southern white culture, such as in cuisine and musical styles. For instance, gumbo, a dish slaves made with rice and random bits of whatever meat and vegetables could be cobbled together in a boiling pot, eventually found its way to the tables of elite Louisiana families. The inclusion of drums in folk music enjoyed by whites came from the slaves' continued use of drums inherited from African musical idioms, and the banjo, which came to define Appalachian bluegrass music, derived from the slaves' playing of an African instrument known as the banjo. Arguably the most important aspect of African American culture that forged a common identity and reinforced stretched family and community ties was religion. Of the many African peoples who were enslaved by Europeans in the New World, there was a wide diversity of religious belief and expression that were gradually synthesized and syncretized with Christian and Native American belief systems throughout slavery's history in modern America. The Wolof, Serer, Mandinka, Bambara, Fulani, Hausa, and the kingdoms of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were Muslim or influenced by Islam, while the Yoruba, Igbo, Ga, Fon, Bakongo, and Ewe practiced polytheistic tribal religions. Of the latter, a general framework was shared between them of belief in a high god, usually a sky god or storm god or goddess, who created a lesser pantheon which concerns itself with nations, tribes, communities, families, and individuals, rewarding morality and proper worship while punishing immorality and non-observance. Distant ancestor spirits also acted as national, tribal, village, family, and individual guardian spirits to be venerated and sacrificed to as well. Priests, priestesses, and devotees act as mediators and servants to the pantheon, while also acting as diviners and herbalists, or root doctors. Most spirits were purely neutral and could be manipulated by what the Bakongo called minkisi, sacred medicines, for good or ill effect. They also could be consulted by the diviners to answer questions about the past, present, and future, often through the use of bones, nutshells, or stones dropped on the ground or onto specially marked boards, the subsequent patterns subject to the diviner's interpretation. Consequently, West Africans lived in a world surrounded and infused by spirits whose abilities to do good or evil had to be respected, with proper behavior and, in the case of the veneration of ancestors, proper funerary and grave maintenance rites being of critical importance. Failure on any score brought disasters both great and small. Enslaved Africans took these religions with them to the New World, adapting to multi-ethnic mixing and attempts to Christianize them. The quote-unquote slave religions that developed: Candomblé in Brazil, Santeria in Cuba, Shango in Trinidad, and Vodou in Saint-Domingue, Haiti, among many others, blended West African common elements and incorporated elements of Catholic or Protestant Christianity. Over time, the African names for deities have faded or been conflated with others, as gods with similar attributes were eventually given a single name, such as the sky gods who were merged under the name of the Yoruban Dahomeyan god Shango. A widely shared belief in the possession of devotees by members of the pantheon or ancestor spirits was retained, and takes place in elaborate ceremonies typified by vigorous music, dancing, and drumming. West African religions are often known as danced religions. The wearing of significant colors, most notably red or white, was also maintained, and as Christianity gained greater influence over these slave religions, the more overt West African elements were subdued. Catholicism proved most amenable to West African syncretism, as the old gods were conflated with the Catholic saints whose characteristics or duties correlated to those of the old gods. Whereas the divisions between the Africans initially fostered hostility and disunity that benefited the slaveholding regimes, Christianization led to cultural unification, with religion becoming a vital part of slave cultural identity, community solidarity, and individuality. However much Christianity has shaped these religions, they retain strong undercurrents of West African beliefs and practices that persist even to the present day, essentially in the style of performance in ritual action. As the gods of Africa gave way to the God of Christianity, the African heritage of singing, dancing, spirit possession, and magic continued to influence African American folk religion. That this was so is evidence of the slave's ability not only to adapt to new contexts, but to do so creatively. The justification for enslaving Africans had always been as a step in the process of civilizing and Christianizing them, but slaveholders rarely showed any interest in instructing their slaves in the rudiments of Christianity. Much of this was due to the fact that the Bible prohibited Christians holding other Christians as slaves, but colonial legislatures sidestepped this stricture by formalizing that baptism did not change any slave's status. Nevertheless, Masters were generally loath to convert their slaves into anything other than productive and profitable labor. Christianization, many argued, would make slaves unruly and rebellious, and the notion of spiritual equality between blacks and whites was likewise anathema despite many missionaries' assertions to that spiritual equality. Initially, slaves themselves did not readily submit to Christianization and tended to merge their old beliefs with new ones in a manner that was perennially frustrating. Nevertheless, participation in the white man's folk ways amounted to something like tribal adoption that was a kind of stepbrotherhood that slaves did readily embrace and which masters and other whites warily accepted. The first great awakening in the 18th century really began the process of slave Christianization, as the emotional evangelicalism of the New Light Baptists and Presbyterians, as well as of the Methodists, particularly appealed to Africans and African Americans who found Anglicanism and the more established denominations staid and unenergetic, largely uninteresting. So well did some slaves and free blacks take to evangelicalism that some became lay exhorters and preachers in their own right, mainly to slaves and free blacks, but in some cases to whites as well. In the South, it was the Baptists and the Methodists who attracted the most black converts, and the tentative rise of black preachers was both hailed as a boon and also a source of concern. For all the success that evangelical Protestantism made in the late 18th century and early 19th century South among slaves and free blacks, it always ran up against considerable white resistance, which placed great pressure on the national and local Baptist and Methodist organizations to de-emphasize the egalitarian impulses of slave Christianization and to back away from an early anti-slavery bias that prohibited growth among rural and urban whites. The egalitarian trend in evangelicalism, which drove some Methodists, Baptists, and Presbyterians to condemn slavery, foundered on the intransigency of that institution in the South. Gabriel's rebellion in Richmond, Virginia in 1800 was blamed in part on slave evangelicalism, and reactionary laws circumscribing slave Christianity to white domination ensued throughout the South. In any case, despite impressive progress, the majority of slaves remained only minimally touched by Christianity by the second decade of the 19th century. Christianity's value as a means of controlling slaves had undoubtedly been recognized, and the variety of slave Christianity that was propagated by white missionaries was essentially one stressing submission and obedience. But slaves were empowered by a Christianity that resonated with their lost African heritages and began to fashion an invisible institution free of white control. Slaveholders were greatly encouraged to allow denominational missionary outreaches to their slaves on the grounds that Christian slaves were happier, better workers, and, more to the point, it blunted the attacks by Northern abolitionists. Slaves themselves, faced with contradictory messages from whites, responded in a variety of ways, ranging from acceptance of Christian slave docility and obedience to righteous egalitarian revolutionism. The invisible institution of popular slave religion expressed itself in the coded language of work songs and spirituals, so-called hush harbors in swamps, woods, culverts, and thickets, and a message of liberationist Christianity contrary to the accommodationist Christianity propagated by white ministers and parroted by their black counterparts. There, in the relative privacy of the hush harbors and improvised tabernacles, slaves prayed for their liberation and for justice against their masters, which would never have been tolerated in the formal Christianity they were allowed, and in some cases forced, to practice. Christianity for the slaveholding whites supported the existing order in that it confirmed them in their assumptions of white superiority, black inferiority, and the justice of slavery. Christianity's propagation among the slaves was essentially geared toward controlling them and reinforcing the planters' worldview. Slaves were perfectly aware that Christianity denied these delusions, and they chafed against the accommodationist faith constantly drummed into them by whites and some black preachers alike. That slaves appeared to accept this planter-defined Christianity, even when they maintained a very different faith hidden from their master's view, served to uphold the peculiar institution, though this should not indict the slaves as de facto collaborators in their bondage and oppression. By and large, slaves rejected their master's Christianity and fashioned a Christianity of their own that was partly visible and mostly hidden. White Christian morality, especially strictures against stealing and lying, was patently rejected, as were much of the dominant culture's mores, and they used Christianity and the Bible to support their direct and indirect indictments of the slaveholding regime. Rather than a tool of accommodation, it could become a means to power and moral superiority to masters and supporters of the slaveholding regime, as when a slave who was being whipped for a theft he never committed found it in his heart to forgive his erring master. He was taking his punishment without too much complaint, yet was consoled by his rectitude and spiritual superiority. Christian slaves consoled themselves that they would go to heaven, while their masters, no matter how kind, would burn in hell. Christianity may have been a means of social control, but slaves were able to turn it around on their masters and make of it a means to endure and gradually drain slavery of its seeming naturalness and rightness. They were able to create an inner world where they could develop a scale of values and fixed points of vantage from which to judge the world around them and themselves. They knew that a just God would not allow slavery to exist forever, and broadly assumed that their liberation would be the centerpiece of the apocalypse which inspired Nat Turner in 1830. However, no small number of slaves perceived Christianity as the white man's religion, and consequently no valid religion at all when it condoned such evil, thus refusing to become Christian. It was assumed by most slaveholders and other whites that while Christianization carried some danger of making slaves rebellious, especially since they tended, against their ministers' advice, to fixate on the book of Exodus, and thus that paganism was all the more dangerous, but non-Christian slaves were no more nor less likely to rebel than their Christian counterparts. On rare occasions, slaves were able to wield considerable spiritual power over their masters and other whites, as the popularity of black preachers and the willingness of some whites to have blacks as their pastors attests. To conclude that religion distracted slaves from concern with this life and dissuaded them from action in the present is to distort the full story and to simplify the complex role of religious motivation in human behavior. Slave religion had a this-worldly impact, not only in leading some slaves to acts of external rebellion, but also in helping slaves to assert and maintain a sense of personal value, even of ultimate worth. In the role of preacher, exhorter, and minister, slaves experienced status, achieved respect, and exercised power, often circumscribed but nonetheless real. That some slaves maintained their identity as persons, despite a system bent on reducing them to a subhuman level, was certainly due in part to their religious life. In the midst of slavery, religion was for slaves a space of meaning, freedom, and transcendence. Most whites in the South did not own slaves, not even one. In 1860, more than 6 million of the South's 8 million whites lived in slaveless households. Some slaveless whites lived in cities and worked as artisans, mechanics, and traders. Others lived in the country and worked as storekeepers, parsons, and schoolteachers. But most plain folk were small farmers. Perhaps 3 out of 4 were yeomen, small farmers who owned their own land. As in the North, farm ownership provided a family with an economic foundation, social respectability, and political standing. Unlike their northern counterparts, however, Southern yeomen lived in a region whose economy and society were increasingly dominated by slavery. In an important sense, the South had more than one white yeomanry. The South was huge and provided space enough for 2 yeoman societies, separated roughly along geographic lines. Yeomen throughout the South had much in common, but the life of a small farm family in the Cotton Belt, the flatlands that spread from South Carolina to Texas, differed from the life of a family in the Upcountry, the area of hills and mountains, also known as the Southern Highlands. Some rural slaveless whites were not yeomen at all. They owned no land and were sometimes desperately poor. Plantation Belt yeomen lived within the orbit of the planter class. Even in the plantation belt, small farms outnumbered plantations, but they were dwarfed in importance. Small farmers grew mainly food crops, particularly corn, but they also produced a few 400-pound bales of cotton each year. Large planters measured their crop in hundreds of bales. Small farmers' cotton tied them to planters. Unable to afford cotton gins or baling presses of their own, they relied on slave owners to gin and bale their cotton. With no link to merchants in the port cities, plantation belt yeomen also turned to better connected planters to ship and sell their cotton. A network of relationships connected small farmers and planters. Planters hired out surplus slaves to ambitious yeomen who wanted to expand cotton production. They sometimes chose the sons of local farm families as overseers. Plantation mistresses occasionally nursed ailing neighbors. Family ties could span class lines, making planter and yeoman kin as well as neighbors. Yeomen helped police slaves by riding in slave patrols, which nightly rode country roads to make certain that no slaves were moving about without permission. On Sundays, plantation dwellers and plain folk came together in church to worship. Plantation belt yeomen may have envied and at times even resented wealthy slaveholders, but small farmers learned to accommodate. Planters made accommodation easier by going out of their way to behave as good neighbors and avoid direct exploitation of slaveless whites in their community. As a consequence, rather than raging at the oppression of the planter regime, the typical plantation belt yeoman sought entry into it. He dreamed of adding acreage to his farm, buying a few slaves of his own, and retiring from exhausting field work. By contrast, the hills and mountains of the South resisted the spread of slavery and plantations. In the western parts of Virginia, North Carolina, and South Carolina, in northern Georgia and Alabama, and in eastern Tennessee and Kentucky, the higher elevation, colder climate, rugged terrain, and poor transportation made it difficult for commercial agriculture to make headway. As a result, planters and slaves were scarce. Geographically isolated, the upcountry was a yeoman stronghold. All members of the upcountry farm family worked, their tasks depending on their sex and age. Husbands labored in the fields, and with their sons they cleared, plowed, planted, and cultivated primarily food crops: corn, wheat, beans, sweet potatoes, and perhaps some fruit. Wives and their daughters labored in and about the cabin. Women also tended the vegetable garden, kept a cow and some chickens, preserved food, cleaned their homes, fed their families, and cared for their children. Male and female tasks were equally crucial to the farm's success, but as in other white Southern households, the male patriarch ruled the domestic sphere. The typical upcountry yeoman also grew a little cotton or tobacco, but food production was more important than cash crops. Not much currency changed hands in the upcountry. Barter was common. A yeoman might trade his small cotton or tobacco crop to a country store owner for a little salt, bullets, needles, and nails, or swap extra sweet potatoes for a plow from a blacksmith or for leather from a tanner. Networks of exchange and mutual assistance tied individual homesteads to the larger community. Farm families joined together in log rolling, house and barn raising, and corn husking. Even the hills had some plantations and slaves, but the few upcountry folks who owned slaves usually had only one or two. As a result, slaveholders had much less social and economic power, and yeomen had more. But the upcountry did not oppose slavery. As long as plain folk there were free to lead their own lives, they defended slavery and white supremacy just as staunchly as other white Southerners. The majority of slaveless white Southerners were hard-working, land-holding small farmers, but Northerners held a different image of non-slaveholding whites. They believed that slavery had condemned most whites to poverty and backwardness. One anti-slavery advocate charged that the South harbored three classes: the slaves on whom devolves all the regular industry, the slaveholders who reap all the fruits, and an idle and lawless rabble who lived dispersed over vast plains little removed from absolute barbarism. Critics called this third class a variety of derogatory names: hillbillies, crackers, rednecks, and poor white trash. According to critics, poor whites were not just whites who were poor. They were also supposedly ignorant, diseased, and degenerate. Contrary to Northern opinion, only about 1 in 4 non-slaveholding rural white men was landless and very poor. Some worked as tenants, renting land and struggling to make a go of it. Others survived by herding pigs and cattle. And still others worked for meager wages, ditching, mining, logging, and laying track for railroads. Some poor whites succeeded in climbing the economic ladder, but in the 1850s, upward mobility slowed. The cotton boom of that decade caused planters to expand their operations, driving the price of land beyond the reach of poor families. Whether they gained their own land or not, however, poor whites shared common cultural traits with yeoman farmers. The lives of most plain folk revolved around farms, family, a handful of neighbors, the local church, and perhaps a country store. Work occupied most hours, but plain folk still found time for pleasure. Dancing they are all fond of, a visitor to North Carolina discovered, especially when they can get a fiddle or bagpipe. Public schools were scarce, and private academies charged fees that yeomen could not afford. Education is not extended to the masses here as at the North, observed a Northern visitor. Although most people managed to pick up basic reading and math, approximately one Southern white man in 5 was illiterate in 1860, and the rate for white women was even higher. People here prefer talking to reading, a Virginian remarked. Telling stories, reciting ballads, and singing hymns were important activities in yeoman culture. Plain folk spent more hours in revival tents than in classrooms. Preachers spoke day and night to save souls, and by mid-century, Baptists and Methodists had become the South's largest religious groups. By emphasizing free choice and individual worth, the plain folks' religion was hopeful and affirming. Hymns and spirituals provided guides to right and wrong, praising humility and steadfastness, condemning drunkenness and profanity. Above all, hymns spoke of the eventual release from worldly sorrows and the assurance of eternal salvation. The concordances with African American religion are impossible to ignore here. All white Southerners, slaveholders and slaveless alike, considered themselves superior to all blacks, but not every black Southerner was a slave. In 1860, some 260,000, approximately 6%, of the region's 4 million Africans were free. What is surprising is not that their numbers were small, but that they existed at all. According to pro-slavery thinking, blacks were supposed to be slaves. Only whites were supposed to be free. Blacks who were free stood out, and whites made them targets of oppression. But a few found success despite the restrictions placed on them by white Southerners. The population of free blacks expanded after the Revolutionary War, when the natural rights philosophy of the Declaration of Independence, the egalitarian message of evangelical Protestantism, and a depression in the tobacco economy of the Upper South led to a brief flurry of emancipation, the act of freeing from slavery. The rising numbers of free blacks worried white Southerners who, because of the cotton boom, wanted more slaves, not more blacks who were free. In the 1820s and 1830s, state legislatures slowed the growth of the free black population and shrank the liberty of those blacks who had gained their freedom. New laws denied masters the right to free their slaves. Other laws subjected free blacks to special taxes, prohibiting them from interstate travel, denied them the right to have schools, prohibited voting, and required them to carry so-called freedom papers to prove that they were not slaves. Increasingly, whites subjected free blacks to the same laws as slaves. Free blacks could not testify under oath in a court of law or serve on juries. Free blacks were forbidden to strike whites, even in self-defense. Laws confined most free African Americans to poverty and dependence. Typically, free blacks were rural, uneducated, unskilled agricultural laborers and domestic servants who had to scramble to survive. Opportunities of any kind, for work, education, or community, were slim. Planters believed that free blacks set a bad example for slaves, subverting the racial subordination that was the essence of slavery. Whites feared that free blacks might lead slaves in rebellion. In 1822, whites in Charleston accused Denmark Vesey, a free black carpenter, of conspiring with slaves to slaughter Charleston's white inhabitants. The authorities rounded up scores of suspects who, prodded by torture and the threat of death, implicated others in the conspiracy. Although the city fathers never found any weapons and Vesey and most of the accused steadfastly denied the charges of conspiracy, officials hanged 35 black men, including Vesey, and banished another 37 blacks from the state. Despite increasingly harsh laws and stepped-up persecution, free African Americans made the most of the advantages their status offered. Unlike slaves, free blacks could legally marry and pass on their heritage of freedom to their children. Freedom also meant that they could choose occupations and own property. For most, however, these economic rights proved only theoretical, for a majority of the South's free blacks remained propertyless. Still, some free blacks escaped the poverty and degradation whites thrust upon them. Particularly in the South's cities, a free black elite emerged. consisting of light-skinned African Americans. This group worked at skilled trades as tailors, carpenters, mechanics, and the like. Their customers were prominent whites, planters, merchants, and judges, who appreciated their able, respectful service. Urban whites enforced many of the restrictive laws only sporadically, allowing free blacks room to maneuver. They operated schools for their children and traveled in and out of their states, despite laws forbidding both activities. They worshipped with whites in separate seating and lived scattered about in white neighborhoods, not in ghettos, and some even owned slaves. Of the 3,200 black slaveholders, barely 1% of the free black population. Most owned only a few family members whom they could not legally free. Others owned slaves in larger numbers and exploited them for labor. One such free black slave owner was William Ellison of South Carolina. Born a slave in 1790, Ellison bought his freedom in 1816 and set up business as a cotton gin maker, a trade he had learned as a slave. His business grew with the cotton boom, and by 1835 he was prosperous enough to purchase the home of a former governor of the state. By the time of his death in 1861, he had become a cotton planter, with 63 slaves and an 800-acre plantation. Most free blacks neither became slaveholders like Ellison nor sought to raise a slave rebellion, as whites accused Denmark Vesey of doing. Rather, most free blacks simply tried to preserve their freedom, which was under increasing attack. Unlike blacks in the North, whose freedom was secure, free blacks in the South clung to a precarious freedom by seeking to impress whites with their reliability, economic contributions, and respectable behavior. By the mid-19th century, all Southern white men, planters and plain folk, and no Southern black men, even those who were free, could vote. But even after the South's politics became democratic for white males, political power remained unevenly distributed. The non-slaveholding white majority wielded less political power than their numbers suggested. The slaveholding white minority wielded more. With a well-developed sense of class interest, slaveholders engaged fully in party politics, elections, and office holding, and as a result they received significant benefits from state governments. Non-slaveholding whites were concerned mainly with preserving their liberties and keeping their taxes low. They asked government for little of an economic nature, and they received little. Slaveholders sometimes worried about non-slaveholders' loyalty to slavery, but most whites accepted the planters' argument that the existing social order served all Southerners' interests. Slavery rewarded every white man, no matter how poor, with membership in the South's white ruling race. It also provided the means by which non-slaveholders might someday advance into the ranks of the planters. White men in the South argued furiously about many things, but they agreed that they should take land from Indians, promote agriculture, uphold white supremacy and masculine privilege, and defend slavery from its enemies. In the first half of the 19th century, Southerners eliminated the wealth and property requirements that had once restricted political participation. By the 1850s, every state had extended the right to vote to all adult white males. Most Southern states also removed the property requirements for holding state offices. To be sure, undemocratic features lingered. Plantation districts still wielded disproportionate power in several state legislatures. Nevertheless, Southern politics took place within an increasingly democratic political structure as it did elsewhere in the nation. White male suffrage ushered in an era of vigorous electoral competition in the South. Eager voters rushed to the polls to exercise their new rights. Candidates crisscrossed their electoral districts, treating citizens to barbecues and bands, rum and races, as well as stirring speeches. In the South, it seemed, everybody talked politics everywhere. As politics became aggressively democratic, it also grew fiercely partisan. From the 1830s to the 1850s, Whigs and Democrats battled for the electorate's favor. Both parties presented themselves as the plain white folks' best friend. All candidates declared their allegiance to Republican equality and pledged themselves to defend the people's liberty. And each party sought to portray the other as a collection of rich, snobbish, selfish men who had anti-democratic designs up their silk sleeves. Whether Whig or Democrat, Southern office holders were likely to be slave owners. The master's power over slaves did not translate directly into political authority over whites, however. In the 19th century, political power could only be won at the ballot box, and almost everywhere non-slaveholders were in the majority. Yet year after year, proud and noisily egalitarian common men elected wealthy slaveholders. By 1860, the percentage of slave owners in state legislatures ranged from 41% in Missouri to nearly 86% in North Carolina. Legislators not only tended to own slaves, they often owned large numbers. The percentage of planters, those individuals with 20 or more slaves, in Southern legislatures in 1860 ranged from 5% in Missouri to 55% in South Carolina. Even in North Carolina, where only 3% of the state's white families belonged to the planter class, nearly 36% of state legislators were planters. Clearly, plain folk did not throw the planters out of office. Upper-class dominance of Southern politics reflected the elite's success in persuading the yeoman majority that what was good for slaveholders was also good for plain folk. In reality, the South had, on the whole, done well by common white men. Most had farms of their own. They participated as equals in a democratic political system. They enjoyed an elevated social status, above all blacks and in theory equal to all other whites. They commanded patriarchal authority over their households, and as long as slavery existed, they could dream of joining the planter class. Slaveless white men found much to celebrate in the slave South. Most slaveholders took pains to win the plain folks' trust and to nurture their respect. One non-slaveholder told his wealthy neighbor that he had a bright political future because he never thought of himself too good to sit down and talk to a poor man. Mary Boykin Chestnut of South Carolina complained about the fawning attention her husband, a U.S. Senator, showed to poor men, including one who had mud sticking up through his toes. But smart candidates found ways to convince wary plain folk of their democratic convictions and egalitarian sentiments, whether they were genuine or not. Walter L. Steele, who ran for a seat in the North Carolina legislature in 1846, detested campaigning for votes, but he learned, he said, to speak with a candied tongue. Georgia politics illustrate how well planters protected their interests in state legislatures. In 1850, about half of the state's revenues came from taxes on slaves, the principal form of planter wealth. However, the tax rate on slaves was puny, only about one-fifth the rate on land. Planters benefited from public spending far more than other groups did. Financing railroads, which carried cotton to market, was the largest state expenditure. The legislature also established low tax rates on land, the principal form of yeoman wealth, which meant that the typical yeoman's annual tax bill was small. Still, relative to their wealth, large slaveholders paid less than did other whites. Relative to their numbers, they got more. Slaveholding legislators protected planters' interests and gave the impression of protecting the small farmers' interests as well. In addition to politics, slaveholders defended slavery in other ways. In the 1830s, Southerners decided that slavery was too important to debate. Powerful whites dismissed slavery's critics from college faculties, drove them from pulpits, and hounded them from political life. Sometimes anti-slavery Southerners fell victim to vigilantes and mob violence. One could defend slavery. One could even delicately suggest mild reforms. But no Southerner could any longer safely call slavery evil or advocate for its destruction. In the South, therefore, the rise of the common man occurred alongside the continuing, even growing power of the planter class. Rather than pitting slaveholders against non-slaveholders, elections remained an effective means of binding the region's whites together. Elections affirmed the sovereignty of white men, whether planter or rich folk, and the subordination of African Americans. Those twin themes played well among white women as well. Though unable to vote, white women supported equality for whites and slavery for blacks. In the antebellum South, the politics of slavery helped knit together all of white society. By the early 19th century, northern states had either abolished slavery or put it on the road to extinction, while southern states were building the largest slave society in the New World. Regional differences increased over time, not only because the South became more and more dominated by slavery, but also because developments in the North rapidly propelled it in a very different direction. By 1860, one-third of the South's population was enslaved. Bondage saddled blacks with enormous physical and spiritual burdens, hard labor, harsh treatment, broken families, and most important, the denial of freedom itself. Although degraded and exploited, they were not defeated. Out of African memories and New World realities, blacks created a life-affirming African American culture that sustained and strengthened them. Their families, religion, and community provided defenses against white racism and power. Defined as property, they refused to be reduced to things. Perceived as inferior beings, they rejected the notion that they were natural slaves. The South was not merely a society with slaves. It had become a slave society. Slavery shaped the region's economy, culture, social structure, and politics. Whites south of the Mason-Dixon line believed that racial slavery was necessary and just. By making all blacks a subordinate class, all whites gained a measure of equality and harmony. Many features of Southern life helped to confine class tensions among whites: the wide availability of land, rapid economic mobility, the democratic nature of political life, the patriarchal power among all white men, and, most of all, slavery and white supremacy. All stress along class lines did not disappear, however, and anxious slaveholders continued to worry that yeomen would defect from the pro-slavery consensus. But during the 1850s, white Southerners' acceptance of slavery would increasingly unite them in political opposition to their Northern neighbors.